Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another First Friday event sponsored by the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee. I hope you've all are well, hopefully been vaccinated and staying healthy. This evening we have a familiar local resident who will be speaking to us, and that's Bill Davidow. Bill is a fantastic person. He's not only a writer who's written well on many subjects, including his new book, Autonomous Revolution, which he'll be speaking about this evening, but Bill is also a philanthropist. He's involved with the Nature Conservancy. He's a trained electronic engineer. So his background in the subject that he'll be speaking on is unquestionably terrific. So Bill has spoken for us in the past, back in the days when we were in Independence Hall, and we're all looking forward to his presentation this evening. So without further ado, let's bring on Bill. Bill, are you out there?
I am. Thank you very much, Tom. It's just great to be here. For the third time in the history of humanity, civilization is undergoing phase change. The first time was with the agricultural revolution, the second time, the industrial revolution, and we're now deep into the autonomous revolution. Now, everybody who's listening to me is extremely familiar with phase change in the physical world. For example, you've all observed the miracle of a snowflake. The snowflake starts out as water vapor high in the sky, and a little bit of that water vapor condenses on a dust or pollen particle, and that particle gets heavier. And as it falls to Earth, it falls through different temperatures, different pressures, and different humidities, so that that particle takes a unique path to the Earth. And those pressures, temperatures, and humidities influence the rate of crystal growth. And for that reason, every snowflake that reaches the ground is different. That is the miracle of a snowflake, and illustrative of the miracle of phase change. Well, when water turns to ice, it goes through a critical temperature, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it does, it changes form. It goes from being a liquid to a solid. When it does that, it obeys different rules: fluid dynamics for water, solid mechanics for ice. And we use different tools on water than we do on ice. Pumps and pipes work just fine on water. Icebreakers don't work so well on water. Importantly for our discussion today, our intuition about water vapor or water tells us absolutely nothing about snowflakes or ice. And there's another serious message here. Phase change can cause problems. Ice breaks pipes, or it sinks ships. Remember the Titanic. That is the reality of phase change. Our institutions, our social institutions, go through phase change as well. And when they do, they change in form. They obey different rules, laws. We use different tools in dealing with them. Our intuition about what is going to happen frequently fails us, and social phase change often creates problems, things like the French Revolution. Well, to make this a little bit more tangible, I'd like to give you an example of phase change at work. And I'd like to start off with bank robbery. In the early 1900s, Willie Sutton robbed from banks because that was where the money was. Sutton pulled off about 100 bank robberies, and in the process stole on the order of $20 million, equivalent to $300 million today. That meant in today's dollars, Sutton was getting $300,000 a robbery. The form of his robbery was that he would use his tools, guns, and escape cars, go to the teller window and say, "Give me the cash." Well, today, if a bank robber uses Sutton's tools and goes to a teller window and attempts a bank robbery, he gets around $5,000. Using bank robberies of that form isn't a very profitable business anymore. So it is time to change the form of bank robbery and enter cybercrime. Well, the bank's intuitions and the financial institutions' intuitions failed them. They weren't cognizant of the dangers, so they put a lot of insecure information about customers on the internet. And when they did, it made sense to change the form of bank robbery. What it made sense to do was to steal small amounts of money from lots of customers' checking accounts as a way of stealing a large amount of money from a bank. The tools that people used were the internet and bots and malware. And it didn't take very long for a syndicate to figure out how to really do it right. Citadel installed or put in place 1,500 botnets, and those botnets installed 1.2 million copies of Zeus malware on bank customers' computers. In the end, Citadel stole $500 million for the biggest bank heist in bank heist history. And amazingly, there were basically no rules because we didn't understand a lot about cybercrime. And as best I can tell, only one person has gone to jail. He was a minor player and he got 4 years. 4 years for stealing $500 million. Well, I pointed out that civilization has undergone phase change twice in the past, the agricultural and industrial revolutions. And I think it's safe to say that social phase change isn't driven by endo and exothermic reactions. It's driven by equivalences. The agricultural revolution was driven by a food equivalence. What we did is we substituted domesticated food for wild food and hunting and gathering. The Industrial Revolution was driven by a power equivalence. What we did is we substituted mechanical power for animal muscle power and human muscle power. So what happened was quite remarkable. During the Agricultural Revolution, the form of life changed. We went from wandering tribes to settlements, to villages, to cities. Commerce changed form as well. Before the Agricultural Revolution, barter worked pretty well. But as the amount of exchanges went up and the amount of trade went up, you had to make them more efficient. So mankind invented money. And once he had money, markets became possible. So the form of exchange trade changed. And then the forms of governments changed. We went from tribal chiefs to rulers to city-states to democracies. And ultimately, civilization emerged with writing, numbers, arts, literature, and the rule of law. Similar big changes in form happened during the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, we were all pretty much entrepreneurs. We lived on farms, raised our own food, and sold our surpluses. Or we might have worked in a cottage industry where we wove cloth or made thread on a loom or made shoes, and we sold our own products that we manufactured. But after the Industrial Revolution took place, we created the job. And what happened is we went to work for others who paid us for our labor, and they sold our output. And we became dependent upon others. We became dependent upon employers and dependent upon the government. Commercial hierarchies also emerged. Large corporations like Standard Oil, Ford, and General Motors. And then the form of society changed. In the 1800s, 94% of the population lived in rural environments. Today, 80% of us live in urban environments. And the economy went through different forms. We went from an agricultural economy to an economy that was driven by manufacturing to one that today is 80% services. And amazingly, we went from small government to big government. In 1800, the federal government was operating on 3% of GDP. Today, taxes of all forms of government in the United States run around 36% overall, and in many other countries, they are much higher. Well, the autonomous revolution is the third phase change in human history, and it is driven by three equivalences, not just one. The first is a little bit abstract. It's something I call an information equivalence. When you look at a bank building, you see a building, but what you're really looking at is an information processing system. Think about a physical office building. You arrive at the office building in a car. You put your car in the parking lot. You arrive and you take the elevator up, a physical process. Then you sit at your desk. Then you engage in information exchange. Some of that information is exchanged verbally, sometimes on pieces of paper, sometimes by computer networks. And of course, we have information storage. Some of that information stored is stored on paper, some in our memories, and some in electronic files. And of course, we have lots of voice recognition and voice synthesis equipment. People listen and talk to one another. Well, that office building can be reduced to a few racks of electronics with some good voice recognition systems, some good speech synthesis systems, some good data storage systems, and some good artificial intelligence. And when that happens, hundreds of thousands of square feet of office building occupied by thousands of people that we call a center, a call center, become the information equivalent of a few racks of electronics. Or look at your iPhone and realize that the bank of the future is going to be the information equivalent of just some applications on your iPhone. The second equivalence driving the autonomous revolution is an intelligence equivalence. We substitute machine intelligence for human intelligence. And the third equivalence is a spatial equivalence. We substitute virtual space for physical space. We shop on Amazon and we buy in a virtual store, or we socialize on Facebook rather than meeting our friends in physical space. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the phase change issues that are of great concern to me. And there are lots of these issues that one could talk about, but I've chosen three for this evening. I want to explain to you why this time things are going to be different. Because I hear from a lot of people that, well, technology is displacing jobs, but it's always displaced jobs. It's done that in the past. And in the future, we're going to create new jobs just like we have in the past. Well, I think this time things may be different. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about jobs specifically, and then I want to make some comments about free speech. I think it is important to realize that I am optimistic about our ability to deal with phase change. History is on my side. We have successfully dealt with it twice in the past in the agriculture and industrial revolution. And at those times when we were dealing with phase change, we were dealing with it in a time of scarcity. Today, we are living in a world of abundance and one of skyrocketing productivity. That should make it easier for us to deal with phase change. And then we've got fascinating virtual space that puts the world of information at our fingertips. It provides us with new forms of entertainment, and it makes it possible for us to go on virtual travel and have all kinds of different virtual experiences. But in order to benefit from this, we are going to have to think differently. We are going to have to apply new rules, and we're going to have to come up with new tools. So why is this time different? And one of the principal reasons why this time is different is the nature of today's technology as opposed to the technology of the past. The technologies of the past were efficiency technologies, were displacement technologies, and they had very, very large creation effects. Today's technologies are extremely good at efficiency and extremely good at displacement, which much smaller creation effects. So I'd like to give you an example to make this a lot more tangible. Think about the automobile. It had tremendous displacement effects. It displaced the horse, and the horse constituted a large percentage of the economy. 27% of the farmland in our country was devoted to raising feed for horses. Farmers lost a big market. There were 427 blacksmiths and 249 carriage makers in New York City. And there were lots of people involved in the care and feeding and driving of horses. All of that went away. And I know that when we think about the automobile, we think about people going to work in Henry Ford's factory, but a lot more happened than that. First of all, the automobile created demand for lots of materials. It created a big demand for steel. Automobiles didn't run on hay, they ran on oil. So we developed the oil industry. And then they ran on rubber tires, and we needed a lot of glass for those windshields. And of course, even the old automobiles broke down. So we needed mechanics. And even though they didn't go very fast, people still ran into one another. So we needed insurance. But that was only part of it. As cars started driving faster and faster, we disliked driving on dirt roads with lots of holes in them. And so we began to pave those roads. And pretty soon we developed highways. And then we realized that we could drive to work in a more distant location. And people perceived the cities as being unhealthy. And they suddenly decided that they could live in the suburbs. And so there was a suburban construction boom that took place after the 1950s. If one were to look at the economy in 1970, a tremendous amount of it was directly a result of the creation effects and indirectly a result of the creation effects of the automobile. Or perhaps you'd like to think about the semiconductor. It displaced the vacuum tube. And at the time that it did that, the worldwide electronics market was $29 billion. Today, it is 50 times as large, 1.5 trillion. And it's full of computers and lap phones and smart tops. And by 2025, there's supposed to be 75 billion Internet of Things devices in use around the world. Well, think of what happens when Amazon replaces a physical store. The physical store goes away, but retail sales don't skyrocket. It's just a more efficient way of getting goods to you. Or think about the miraculous iPhone and devices like it. They effectively displaced a lot of the media business. CD sales dropped from 27 billion to 15 billion. And when that happened, we didn't need the distribution channels that supported them. Virgin Records, Virgin Megastores went away. Tower Records went out of business. And all of us remember the 9,000 Blockbuster video stores that we used to go to get videotapes so we could watch a home movie. Those stores employed 60,000 people. Well, today we don't make nearly as many CDs and DVD players. And in the final indignity of it all, the iPhone has displaced the iPod, which started it all. Well, we certainly have some creation effects. You can get all the music you want on Spotify. You can watch all the music, all the movies you want on Netflix. And so we created new enterprises. But I was amazed when I realized and found out, and somebody pointed this out to me, that Netflix had only 1,000 workers when it displaced 9,000 Blockbuster video stores and 60,000 workers. These are the type of displacement effects that happen. And they have another important effect. They play a big role in something I call non-monetizable productivity. Now, there have always been two types of productivity around. We only use the word productivity. And when we are talking about that type of productivity, we are talking about something that I call monetizable productivity. Robert Gordon, in his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, has written a lot about monetizable productivity. And he pointed out that between 1920 and 1970, productivity growth grew at 2.8% a year, and it did that for 50 years. And it had an amazing effect. GNP increased at 3.2% a year. When GNP increases faster than productivity, it does two things. It creates jobs, and it also drives up salaries. And we went through a period driven by productivity of amazing prosperity and growth in our country. Today's tools create massive increases in productivity. But the productivity growth is so great that frequently we get oversupply, or we can make things so cheaply that prices fall and markets shrink. That's what I call non-monetizable productivity. Well, I didn't realize it, but I was first exposed to non-monetizable productivity in the 1970s by Bob Noyce, who was the inventor of the integrated circuit and one of the founders of Intel. I worked at Intel at that time, and one day Bob was walking back to his office and he looked quite irritated to me. And I said, "Bob, what's bothering you?" And he said, "Well, I've just gotten back from a meeting with financial analysts, and they tell me that Intel employees aren't being productive. I tell them that I have the most productive employees in the world. We're producing 40% more transistors per employee every year. The problem is the price per transistor is falling so fast that the dollar output per employee isn't increasing. It's not that my employees aren't productive. It's a problem with pricing." That is what is happening with non-monetizable productivity. It is becoming a lot more prevalent in our economy today than it has been in the past. Look at the newspaper industry. Print media went from $46 billion to $22 billion in a decade. Newspaper employees went from 450,000 to 250,000. And I'll bet not many of us really miss them. We all get our news. We get it more quickly. We get it as video. It is terrific. Non-monetizable productivity is at work, and the quality of the product is better than ever. The third thing that is happening is that we're now living in what I call a bipolar economy. In the past, the economy was more homogeneous. When the price of goods went up, wages increased. And so inflation was hooked, it was correlated with both price and wage increases. Today, the value of work for many, many middle class Americans is being set by the wages that a robot is willing to work for. For that reason, the median household income has remained flat since the year 2000 for many middle class Americans. Unfortunately, the necessities that make up 80% of the middle class Americans' expenditures are increasing in price faster than inflation. Homes prices increased at twice the rate of inflation. Healthcare costs have grown 54% in the past 5 years. The cost of food is rising faster than inflation. The typical middle class worker is working in a deflationary economy and trying to live in an inflationary one. I don't think it is too hard to understand the rise of populism. Well, what about jobs? McKinsey, about 5 or 10 years ago, published a report that estimated that by 2025, 400 to 800 million jobs worldwide would be displaced by automation. I looked at another McKinsey report and I did a little analysis of it, and I concluded looking at that report that automation would replace 50 million jobs in the United States by 2025. Now, that's a lot of jobs since we only have 120 million jobs. Now, obviously, we create a lot of new jobs, and I doubted these numbers because they were so large. So I thought I would look at some examples. And the example I picked was the level 5 autonomous vehicle, known as the driverless Uber. Many of you are familiar with the concept. The idea is that a very, very smart car would drive around and you could call it on your smartphone and you could say, hey, come here and pick me up. It would drive to your home, pick you up, and then on your smartphone, you tell the car to take you wherever you wanted to go, and the car would drive there, drop you off, and drive off and go off and pick up somebody else. Our intuition about this is sort of wrong. We worried about Uber replacing the poor taxi or limo driver. And I worry about that, but there are only about 250,000 taxi and limo drivers in the United States. The driverless Uber, by my computation, is probably going to displace 4.5 million jobs. Here is how it happens. The driverless Uber eliminates the need for a lot of people to own a car. And when I replace an owned car with a shared car, it saves the consumer about $3,000 per car. There are 260 million cars in the United States. Replacing 30% of them with driverless Ubers would save about $234 billion in expenses on automobile repair, automobile service, insurance, and things like that, or the equivalent of about 1.5 million jobs. Then there are almost 9 million people employed in trucking, and a lot of trucks are going to become driverless, and a lot of people in that industry are going to be displaced by automation. I thought maybe we'd lose 2 million jobs there. And then I thought, if there are all these vehicles driving around, it's going to make delivery awfully convenient. And if it does, online sales are going to increase because everything is going to be delivered to me by a driverless Uber. And if the market share of online sales increases by 10%, because online sales are more employee efficient than retail sales. That's another million jobs. I got to 4.5 million jobs that way. Then I began to look at finance and I said, what's going on with finance? And there were 8 million people in finance. And I began to think about me going to the bank on my iPhone. And I thought, gee, it's pretty easy to imagine 4 million people. When I looked at other areas too, things like credit cards that employed a lot of people, 4 million of those jobs vanishing. So if you look at that, that's a total of around 8.5 million jobs. Now, when you lose a primary job, there's a trickle-down effect. If I lose my job, I don't go out to eat at a restaurant, and somebody else loses a job, et cetera, et cetera. And the multiplier effect on those jobs, there are a number of ranges depending on whether it's a manufacturing job or a services job, but 2 is a conservative number. So you lose a primary job and ultimately you use 2 more. So you multiply the 8.5 million by 3 and you come up with 25.5 million jobs. So I thought, hey, maybe the McKinsey number is right. Well, what are we going to do about it? A lot of it, people have talked about creating jobs in manufacturing, and I think it's a great idea, but 80% of us work in services. And that's where a lot of these automation tools and AI tools really add to productivity. So a 1% increase in services leads to a lot of job displacement. 12% of us work in manufacturing. And so a 1% increase in services requires that we increase manufacturing jobs by 6 or 7%. Well, I don't think that we're going to be able to grow manufacturing that fast to offset those kind of productivity gains. So what should we do about jobs? Well, I think streamlining regulation is great. I think we ought to make trade fair. I think we ought to encourage entrepreneurism, but I don't think that's going to be enough. Surprisingly, I concluded that the biggest source of new jobs, or one of the biggest sources of new jobs during the information age, was going to be construction. When phase change happens, societies adopt completely new physical infrastructures. The agricultural revolution went from being a society of nomads to a society of farms and settlements. The Industrial Revolution created urbanization. I suspect that the autonomous revolution will create a new form of urbanization. But before we even get to that, a good place to start is on the backlog of critical construction we already have. We have $3.6 trillion, we have a $3.6 trillion backlog of just standard things to do, like fixing bridges and repairing sewers and filling potholes. So that's $3.6 million worth of construction. Then if we provide 100 million homes with fiber optic communications, that will cost another $500 billion. But I think the really big deal will be rebuilding our cities, where the cities of the future become really living cities. They will have less retail space, more public transit, more green space. And I suspect we're going to discover new ways that people are going to want to live and new living arrangements. In the past, construction was a much bigger part of our economy than it is today. Construction today runs around 5% of GNP. In the 1950s to 1970s, when we were building suburbia and building the national highway system, it ran around 6% of GDP. So maybe construction will be the job end of the future. But that might not be enough. My friend Brian Arthur has pointed out that we have passed the Keynes point. By that, he means that we have plenty of money. It's a problem of income distribution. Arthur points out that if you divide the number of families into the GNP, you come up with $73,000 per employee, per family. We are going to have to deal with the income distribution problem in our country. And one of the most creative solutions I've seen comes from one of the most conservative economists around, Charles Murray. Charles Murray proposed a universal basic income of $13,000 a year for every person in the United States over the age of 18. Now, it would roll off at very high incomes. And on top of that, he would get rid of all other forms of entitlement. So you get rid of the inefficient administration system. Murray's argument is nobody can live on $13,000 a year, but it is enough to help a lot of people. And so people would still have to work. Well, I hope the free market will work when dealing with phase change. But I think we're going to have to think differently. We are going to have to think about solutions like the ones proposed by Murray. Well, there are a lot of other issues to talk about on phase change, but I'd like to make a few brief remarks on free speech. From my point of view, we have never had free speech. I could say whatever I wanted, but no one heard me. It was like yelling from a mountaintop. When we reduced the cost of effective one-to-many communication to zero, we really had free speech. Now, hundreds of millions of people can spread fake news, conspiracy theories, and organize events like the Capitol insurrection. All of these phenomena share a common root cause: zero cost one-to-many communication, facilitated by the internet and social networking and things like this. In the past, the free market controlled free speech. If I wanted to talk to a lot of people, I had to go through mass media, and editors made sure that I was talking fairly responsibly. Or I could talk directly to people if I had a lot of money, like the Koch brothers and Michael Bloomberg. But today, the tools make it so cheap that anybody can engage in the free speech business. Today, we are trying to control the problem with free speech police. Facebook has 15,000 people that do message policing. I think it's a losing battle. I think we can do a lot better by making free speech expensive again. Long ago, in the early 21st century, when free speech didn't cost zero, we didn't have this problem nearly to the degree that we do today. There are ways that we can make free speech more expensive. For example, we can give individuals the ownership of their own private information. When we do this, we reduce the power of recommendation engines, and we make it more difficult to target people. When we do that, we make free speech less efficient. Or we could charge for internet services. We could charge for email. We could charge for more for internet access. I think we are going to have to think about solutions like this to deal with phase change in the future. Well, phase change is going to bring us a number of wonderful miracles. We're going to have new institution forms. Our intuition about how to deal with them isn't going to be good. We're going to have to engage in experiments like UBI and we're going to have to develop new rules and use new tools. And when we do this, we will be making mistakes. But if we address the issues of phase change, we can benefit from the wonderful things that these new tools can bring us for the increases in productivity. If we do it right, we can have snowflakes instead of blizzards. And that's the type of phase change world I want to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. That was, wow. That was, everyone I'm sure has a lot to digest from that, but we are getting some questions. And one of them is, how do we equalize healthcare in the models you've been talking about?
I'll tell you, I wish I knew what to do about healthcare, but it is such a mess, and and I have no idea as to how to go about it. You know, my wife had an accident and we went to the emergency room. It was a simple thing. The charge for going to the emergency room was $9,000. And then there were some x-rays that were another 3,000 or 4,000. I think the bill, turned out to be like $18,000. The good news about it was that by the time the prices were adjusted, we ended up paying $500 or $600. But what has happened in the healthcare industry, as an example, is they have these extremely high rack rates as a way of dealing with the problem, that because of the big discounts that are given to Medicare. And I just can't imagine how you fix the system. And so I should have just stopped and shut up and said I have no idea.
Okay. So we have another question here. How does the pandemic and mass exodus from cities fit into this plan? How important and how do we preserve the arts in this model, since you're being sponsored by Arts and Culture?
Yeah, well, all right. First off, I think the pandemic has associated or accelerated a lot of the things that are happening. It's driven us into the virtual world a lot faster than if we would have gone there. And I believe that we do not understand the implications of the virtual world very well. And if you look at it, the physical world did not have a purpose. It did not have a goal. A tree did not grow to be firewood. A brook did not run to be drinking water. We as humans exploited it. And we shaped the physical world to satisfy our needs. The virtual world is a commercial enterprise, most of it is, and it is there to satisfy a commercial purpose. And I think that a lot of the things that we valued in the physical world are going to be devalued in that virtual world. So I worry a great deal about the arts and culture. And I worry about a lot of the things that made us human. And I think that one of the great challenges that we face is that we evolved to live in a physical world. And we are now taking up residence in a virtual world. And the virtual world is not a world that we evolved to live in. And I worry that it is going to have horrible psychological consequences as a result of that. And for all kinds of things. And we're starting to see some of that phenomena. So I think it's very, very important to use the virtual tools to enhance the quality of your life in the physical world. But I think it is very dangerous to live there. And I see people living there. I think what you want to do is you want to use the virtual world as a tool to enhance the quality of your life in the physical world rather than it being a place that you inhabit. I don't know if that's being specific enough. It's abstract. I'm sorry.
No, I think that was terrific. We have another question here, changing the direction a little bit. And this person is wondering if you have views on how to get society to address climate change with the speed which it needs to be addressed.
I I I I I, I mean, I think that. I mean, I read Gates's book, which it really made me appreciate the problem to a much higher degree. And I I mean, it's going to require a lot of education, and it's going to require a lot of painful sacrifices on people's part. And it's just such a tough problem. And I I think I don't have a good insight into how to approach it. I mean, you know, I think Biden is making some important efforts. Um, but it's a challenging problem.
For sure. Another question is, how is the autonomous revolution going to affect the relations between the sexes, family arrangements, etc., in the future you envision?
Well, that gets back to what I was saying before about living in virtual worlds. I, if you look at our senses, when you move into the virtual world, you are you're you're impaired. Um, your sense of vision is greatly reduced. Your sense of hearing is greatly reduced, and you don't have smell or touch uh, or taste. And you know, when I say your sense of vision is reduced, you only see what is being presented to you on the screen, uh, and uh, and somebody decides what you can see, and the fidelity of it is good, and you lose a lot of eye contact with people, and so I believe that it really is important to move your relationships back into the physical world. And that doesn't mean that you don't use Facebook and you don't associate with people that way. But quite honestly, and I think it's wonderful to be a citizen of the world, but one of the things that made society work was that we were also citizens of our local community. And it really is important to get drawn back into the local community. And all of these things are pulling us out of the community. And so I think we've got to focus on the world that we have evolved to live in a lot more.
I hear you there. Another question here is all this about productivity and monetizing able productivity, but what I think is equally important here is the gender revolution, i.e. the changing relationship of women and men. When political economists first began to consider the implications of commercial and industrial revolutions right after the French Revolution of 1789 to 1795.
I'm not quite clear what the question was there. I'm sorry. I'm missing something.
This person is asking about productivity and monetizing able productivity, but they feel that what is equally important here is the gender revolution, i.e. the changing relationship between men and women when political economists first began to consider the implications of commercial and industrial revolutions.
Yeah, I mean, I do not have a lot of insight into uh, how gender affects economies. I mean, you know, I mean, I can make the simple-minded observation that you've got a tremendous number of extremely valuable and productive people whose talents we weren't using. And, you know, some of the most talented managers and some of the most creative people I've ever worked with um, are women who, when I started my career, would have never had a chance um, to employ those talents productively, and as a result, economic output is less. But I don't think that's a very intelligent comment. I mean, that's about as good as I can do.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. And then we've seen some interesting movements toward unionization and non-unionization taking place throughout this tech economy. Do you have any revolutions or viewpoints on unionization?
Well, you know, when I was growing up, unions were the number one enemy in our household, and I think that unions have a really important role to play, and you know, I, I, and the thing that amazed me when I looked at what was going on with unions when I was growing up is that uh, the companies were trying to destroy the unions, and the unions were doing things that, if they succeeded in doing them, would destroy the companies. And then I would go to Europe and I would find that there were much more cooperative attitudes between unions and companies, where the unions tended to say, hey, if we're going to do well, the companies have to do well. And, you know, what bothers me today about corporate management and unions is that it's so familiar, where we always in this country seem to be creating zero-sum games, where if uh, something is going to be good for uh, workers, it has to be bad for the management. And I wish it wasn't that way. And I was out to dinner last night with a friend of mine, and we were talking about how executives today seem less and less committed to a corporate purpose, and more interested in their own salaries. And I think that today, if you're going to create great businesses, you've got to have management and employees that are committed to the concept of the business and who both want to work together cooperatively. And I, the thing that bothers me about what I see going on is that we seem to be creating adversaries everywhere I look. And I don't think that a business wins when it has an adversarial relationship with its employees.
Do you think that's because of the management feels the pressure from the stockholders to make sure that they are profitable for the stockholders and not necessarily for the betterment of the company?
Well, I think I think a lot of it is that gets back to the Chicago School of Economics, where it said that the only um, obligation of management was to earn profits for its shareholders. And I always believed that if you were a successful company, and I worked for Hewlett Packard when Dave Packard was running the company, and he always said, "Do the right thing, and we'll make a profit." And Packard believed that you took care of customers, and you took care of employees, and you took care of the community. And he had a very holistic view of business. And I think that we've gone through this phase, and now I guess the Business Roundtable came up with this different statement of goals that it realized that great businesses have lots of stakeholders, and I thought, God, we knew about that at Hewlett Packard 50 years ago. And I think that and I don't want to sound like a crackpot idealist, but I believe that the economy and the world is a lot better off if if you begin to pay attention to the interests of others beyond just your own.
Bill, we have so many more questions and so little time, so I think we will have to have you back for another First Friday event, because you have created a huge interest here. And I'm sorry to all those people who are asking questions that we've just run out of time, but I do want to thank Bill very much for being a presenter here this evening, sharing his observations, and for being a part of the community. You mentioned that early on, the importance of being a part of the community, and you certainly have shown that with your involvement. So we thank you. And I want to remind everyone that next month we have another First Friday event. Jim Caldwell will be speaking on Wayne Thibault, a fabulous artist. The great thing about Jim is not only is he a fantastic artist, but he delves into the world of other artists and gives us insight into not only their inspiration, but into their lives. So on behalf of the volunteers of the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And I'd like to leave you with perhaps an appropriate quote from Omar Bradley, former general of the US Army, when he said, "If we continue to develop our technology without wisdom or prudence, our servant may prove to be our executioner." So something to think about. So enjoy your lives, stay healthy, stay well, and we look forward to seeing you all again next month for Jim Caldwell's presentation. So have a pleasant evening.